They wept when they saw it. Not quietly, not privately. 3 years of marching, 2,000 miles of desert and mountain and disease and starvation and ambush. And when Jerusalem finally appeared on the horizon on the morning of June 7th, 1099, the men who had survived it all fell to their knees in the dust and wept like children. They removed their shoes. They walked barefoot on the rocky ground outside the city walls because the earth beneath their feet was holy and their feet were not worthy of it. Hardened knights who had killed men with their hands, veterans who had survived the nightmare crossing of Anatolia where thousands had died of thirst, soldiers who had eaten their horses and their leather belts to stay alive. These men knelt in the dust outside Jerusalem and cried, 13,000 of them. They had started with perhaps 100,000. The rest were dead, scattered across 2,000 miles of road, buried in Anatolia, drowned in the Bosphorus, killed at Antioch, taken by disease in the Syrian summer, simply gone, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked, their sacrifice invisible to the city shimmering in the heat ahead. 13,000 men, exhausted, starving, half mad with thirst in the Palestinian summer, standing outside the walls of the most contested city on earth, held by a well-supplied Fatimid garrison that had poisoned the surrounding wells, stripped the countryside of timber, and was waiting for a relief army marching up from Egypt. Every rational calculation said this siege would fail. It did not fail. And what happened when it succeeded? What the men who had wept at the gates did when those gates finally opened is the part of the story that the triumph tends to obscure. This is not a story about faith moving mountains. This is a story about what 3 years of suffering does to a man, and what that man becomes at the moment he finally gets what he came for. Welcome to the Clash of Ancients. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, new battle every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Here is what most accounts of the siege of Jerusalem get wrong. They frame it as the triumphant finale, the glorious conclusion of the First Crusade, the moment God's will was fulfilled, the payoff for 3 years of suffering. The Crusader chronicles describe it in the language of divine providence. Modern popular history describes it as one of the great military achievements of the medieval world. Both framings are true. Neither is complete. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 was not a triumph of military genius. It was the desperate last act of a broken army that had no home to return to, no retreat to make, and no option except forward. Understanding what made it possible requires understanding what it had cost to get there, and what the men standing outside those walls had already lost before the siege began. The First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in November 1095 at the Council of Clermont. The immediate military justification was a request from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, who needed help against the Seljuk Turks pressing on his eastern borders. The deeper motivation was Jerusalem itself, the holiest city in Christendom under Muslim rule since the 7th century, the place where Christ had walked and died, and in Christian belief, risen. The response across Europe was extraordinary. Tens of thousands of men, nobles, knights, foot soldiers, pilgrims, priests, took the cross and began moving east. Modern estimates of the total force that departed suggest somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people in various contingents, though the military corps of trained soldiers was considerably smaller. What followed was 3 years that reduced that force by more than 80%. The crossing of Anatolia nearly destroyed the army before it reached Syria. Water sources were poisoned or simply absent across hundreds of miles of summer desert. Men and horses died of thirst in numbers that the chronicles struggle to convey. At Antioch in 1098, the Crusaders besieged the city for 8 months, took it, and were then immediately besieged inside it by a Muslim relief army, surviving on the edge of starvation, reduced to eating horses and rats, before a desperate sortie broke the encirclement. By the time the surviving force reached the borders of Palestine in the spring of 1099, it had lost the majority of its men, most of its horses, and an incalculable portion of its collective morale. What remained was something that defied easy categorization. Not an army in any conventional sense, but a community of survivors bound together by shared suffering, shared faith, and the shared knowledge that there was nothing left to go back to. Godfrey of Bouillon had sold his castle at Bouillon to fund the crusade. He had no home waiting in Europe. Raymond IV of Toulouse, the most powerful noble of the expedition, had made clear that he intended to remain in the East regardless of the outcome. These were not men on a military expedition that would end and allow them to return to their former lives. Jerusalem was not the destination of the journey. It was the only destination that remained. The city they approached on June 7th, 1099, was not undefended. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the Fatimid governor, had prepared with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what was coming. The surrounding wells had been poisoned, the countryside had been stripped of timber. Every tree within reasonable distance felled or burned before the Crusaders arrived, specifically to deny them the wood they would need for siege engines. The Christian population of Jerusalem had been expelled, partly to remove potential collaborators, partly to reduce the number of mouths the garrison had to feed. The garrison itself was composed of Arab and Sudanese professional soldiers, well supplied, behind strong walls, and expecting a relief army from Egypt that would arrive within weeks if they could hold long enough. Iftikhar ad-Dawla looked at the 13,000 exhausted men outside his walls and made a reasonable calculation. He could wait them out. He was almost right. The first assault failed completely. On June 13th, 6 days after their arrival, the Crusaders pushed scaling ladders against the northern wall of Jerusalem and attempted to take it by direct assault. The Fatimid archers on the battlements were waiting. The ladders were too short. The men climbing them were cut down before they reached the top. By the end of the day, the walls were unbreached, the ladders were destroyed, and the Crusaders had spent the one resource they could least afford to lose: wood. Every piece of timber in the surrounding countryside had been consumed, either by the Fatimids before the siege began, or by the Crusaders themselves in building the ladders that had just failed. There was nothing left within any reasonable distance to build siege towers, battering rams, or the equipment the walls actually required. The first assault had not merely failed, it had consumed the materials for the second one. The army that had marched 2,000 miles was now sitting outside Jerusalem without the means to take it. What followed was a desperate search across the Palestinian countryside for any remaining timber. Small detachments fanned out into the hills and were systematically harassed by Fatimid cavalry, picked off in ambushes, killed in skirmishes that the chronicles record with a quiet desperation. Men who had survived Anatolia and Antioch were dying in the scrubland outside Jerusalem, looking for wood. Water was equally brutal. The nearest reliable water source was 6 miles from the siege camp, 6 miles in the Palestinian summer heat, in armor, through terrain patrolled by Fatimid cavalry. Every trip to water was a military operation. Men and horses were dying of dehydration within sight of a city whose cisterns were full. The chronicles describe soldiers drinking from puddles, from mud, from sources so contaminated that the cure was nearly as dangerous as the thirst. Morale, which had soared at the first sight of Jerusalem, was collapsing. And then on June 17th, 10 days into the siege, a Genoese fleet appeared off the coast at Jaffa. The fleet carried what the siege needed most: timber, rope, nails, and the skilled engineers and craftsmen who knew how to turn raw materials into siege engines. The supplies were not delivered easily. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem was contested, and the crusader convoy sent to collect them was ambushed by Fatimid cavalry, the fighting fierce enough that multiple contingents had to be diverted to break through. But break through they did. When the timber finally arrived in the siege camp, the atmosphere changed. 2 siege towers were planned, one for the northern wall, under Godfrey of Bouillon, one for the southern wall under Raymond IV of Toulouse. The construction was conducted under constant pressure, Fatimid archers on the walls, cavalry raids on the working parties, and the knowledge, shared by every man in the camp, that a Fatimid relief army was marching from Egypt and would arrive within weeks. The race was explicit. The towers had to be built, moved into position, and the assault launched before the relief army arrived. If the army from Egypt reached Jerusalem while the Crusaders were still outside the walls, the siege was over. Not a fighting retreat, a collapse. 13,000 exhausted men, already at the edge of their endurance, would have nowhere to go and nothing left to fight with. This is the context that the triumphant narrative of Jerusalem's fall consistently underplays. The Crusaders were not attacking from strength. They were attacking because attack was the only option that offered any possibility of survival. Defense, sitting outside those walls and waiting, was simply a slower way to die. Godfrey of Bouillon understood this completely. The Duke who had sold his castle, who had nothing in Europe to return to, who had committed everything he possessed to this campaign. He understood that the assault had to succeed because there was no alternative worth the name. The towers were completed. The assault was set for July 13th. The Fatimid relief army was getting closer. The night of July 12th, 1099, the night before the final assault, was unlike any other night of the siege. The Crusader chronicles describe it in unusual detail, which suggests that the men who were there understood, even as it was happening, that this night was different. This was not another evening of exhausted sleep in a camp that smelled of death and desperation. This was the night before the end, of the siege, of the campaign, of 3 years of everything. The army processed around the walls of Jerusalem, barefoot, all of them, knights and foot soldiers and priests and the handful of women who had survived the journey, barefoot on the rocky ground outside the city, walking the full circuit of the walls in a religious procession that the chronicles describe as penitential, an act of collective humility before the assault. They sang, they prayed, they stopped at the places associated with Christ's passion and stood in silence. The Fatimid garrison watched from the walls and, according to some accounts, mocked them, displaying crosses, making gestures of contempt at the procession below. Whether this is accurate or Crusader propaganda designed to justify what came next, it is recorded in multiple sources. On the Mount of Olives, the assembled army listened to sermons from the priests who had survived the journey with them. Peter the Hermit, who had preached the People's Crusade 4 years earlier, was among them. The message was consistent across every account. Tomorrow was the fulfillment of everything. Tomorrow was what God had called them to do. Tomorrow was the reason all of it, the thirst, the hunger, the death, the 2,000 miles, had been endured. Inside Jerusalem, the night was quieter but no less weighted. Iftikhar ad-Dawla knew the towers were coming. His engineers had prepared, mangonel positioned on the walls to bombard the towers as they approached. Fire arrows readied, barricades erected outside the northern wall to slow the advance of Godfrey's tower. He had received word that the relief army was still days away. He needed to hold through tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days after that. He had held for 5 weeks against an army that should not have been able to threaten him at all. One more day. That was all that was required. Stop for a moment. Tomorrow, thousands of people inside Jerusalem will die. Not soldiers, people. Men and women and children who had lived their entire lives in that city, who had no role in its defense, who had no voice in the decisions that put them inside those walls on this particular night in July of 1099. The crusaders outside the walls believed they were doing God's will. They may have believed it sincerely. After 3 years of suffering that would have broken most human beings, the belief that all of it served a divine purpose was not self-deception. It was the only framework that made what they had endured bearable. Does that change what happens tomorrow? I have been thinking about that question for a long time. I don't have a clean answer. The towers moved on July 13th. Godfrey's tower advanced first, pushed by hundreds of men while Fatimid archers targeted everything that moved. A battering ram worked through 2 days of fighting to clear the barricades blocking the path. Raymond's tower on the southern wall burned. Fire arrows found it on the first day. Everything depended on the northern tower. On July 15th, the ram cleared the last barricade. The tower reached the wall. The drawbridge dropped. Godfrey of Bouillon crossed first. The fighting on the battlements was brutal. No room for formation, just the arithmetic of who was still standing. The wall was breached, and men who had waited 3 years poured across behind him. The defense collapsed. The gates opened. 13,000 men who had buried their friends across 2,000 miles entered Jerusalem. Both sides recorded what happened next. Both agree on the essential fact. The massacre was total. The eyewitness Raymond of Aguilera described wading through blood at the Temple Mount. Tens of thousands died, men, women, children, Muslim and Jewish, combatant and civilian. Godfrey walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept. Outside, the killing continued. Same men, same day, same city. Godfrey was offered the title King of Jerusalem. He refused. He would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He accepted Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre instead. He died the following year, having ruled less than 12 months. Iftikhar ad-Dawla negotiated terms and escaped. The man who defended Jerusalem survived. The population largely did not. The Fatimid relief army arrived too late. Pope Urban II, who called the First Crusade in 1095, the reason 13,000 men marched 2,000 miles, died July 29th, 1099, 14 days after Jerusalem fell. The news had not reached Rome. The man responsible for everything died without knowing it had worked. The cold open asked, "What does 3 years of suffering do to a man?" It makes him capable of extraordinary endurance, genuine faith, and something no chronicle written in the language of triumph can fully account for. The men who wept at the gates wept again inside the city, for entirely different reasons. Jerusalem still stands. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands where Godfrey knelt, barefoot on July 15th, 1099, while the city burned. Pilgrims still come. The city is still contested. Some things do not resolve. When you imagine yourself outside those walls, 3 years from home, friends buried across 2,000 miles, the tower finally moving, what do you feel? And do you know, honestly, what you would do when the gates opened? If this video made you think, subscribe to The Clash of Ancients. We find the moment's history cannot simplify. Share this with someone who thinks they know the Crusades, and drop a comment. Was the fall of Jerusalem a triumph, a tragedy, or something that cannot be named by either? This has been The Clash of Ancients. Some cities remember everything done inside them. Jerusalem remembers more than most, and I will see you in the next one.